Jane, can you hear me?
I can.
So I'm looking at this calendar invitation and it says our meeting is 1 o'clock. So I think it automatically moved me to Eastern time. Does 1 work for you? Oh, wait.
Oh, I think 1 is much better.
Okay, that must be the case because on my calendar now it's saying
Oh,
4
1
p.m.
is
Eastern.
much better.
Okay, good. Now I land at 10:45 in the morning. I should have plenty of time to get over there. So I know.
Do you need a ride or anything? Do you need?
No, thank you. I'm all set. I have my sister, so
Oh,
but
right.
thank you. And so I'll get to the office, but yes.
Oh, are you going to be in the office?
Yeah, that's what I'm planning on.
Are we allowed in?
I probably not, but
Okay. Can I mean, I guess the question, because I'd like to come join you. I mean, that would be.
yeah, actually I would say
better.
come. I would say
Okay.
come. We can do it.
Alright.
And then do you know where my office is?
It's like down in that awful basement down there somewhere.
Yeah.
Why don't
I can find you.
Do
Or
you want to?
text
Why
me.
don't you come up to our office?
Oh, that's true. Well, I think she's going to call my. Well, I have my phone. Let's do either. Let me know once you get there,
Okay.
and I'll do the same. But yeah, let's do it because yeah, we're both vaccinated and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. We're completely.
Okay, so I'm going to go. It says your appointment is booked for Friday, May 14th, 4 p.m. Eastern. So okay, we're good.
Good. Oh, that's so much better. Oh, what a relief.
Yeah, that is good. Okay, I'll be back.
Okay, sounds good. I'm a little concerned where Noah is.
Yeah, there's one person in the waiting room, but I'll let them in after.
I'm gonna just make sure Noah's with us.
Okay. Jane, she's entering now.
Yeah, I got her.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you? Sorry about
Good.
the delay. I'd like to share a presentation. Am I able to do that?
Yeah, Bernie is okay. So I'm here. This is Jane.
Hey, Jane.
Hey, Noah. Bernie Schlager, who's is the director of CLGS, is also here.
I'm waving, but you can't see me. Hi, Bernie.
And is Noah able to screen share? Oh, we can't hear you, Bernie.
Jane, are you able to tap on? For some reason, it's not allowing me. Let me do this. Trying to make Rabbi Noah a co-host. Why is it not letting me do that? Okay, let me keep working on this.
No problem. Jane, anything I should know?
No, all's good. Are you in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem?
Jerusalem.
Okay. How bad is it?
Who knows?
Yeah.
There are a lot of political developments which may end the conflict sooner, which is good. But then there are the political developments that we will have to deal with later. I'm hoping that things are.
Okay. Is everybody missed the last of this academic year in our Jewish Queeries series? You know, they saved the best for last. And so I'm super delighted. I just couldn't be happier. But to welcome Rabbi Noah. I think we've been planning this for 8-9 months, quite a long time. I was really fortunate to read about Rabbi Noah's work in creating a gender inclusive Hebrew, which I know a lot of us have been sort of working on, potchking about in our own separate ways. And for me, not like a native or even fluent Hebrew speaker, though not so bad either. Mostly I try and do it with liturgical Hebrew. And I'm not sure all of us are also aware of the non-binary Hebrew project, which is starting to create a set of ways to move forward, dealing with, as Rabbi Noah described to me in her blurb about this program, that all of Hebrew creates gender assumptions, and we're just having a little tech problem. Sorry about that. Gender assumptions, and what we're looking for is a way to use our sacred tongue, our holy language, in a way that doesn't make us unholy. And so I just, Rabbi Noah is the expert, and I'd like to turn it over to her.
So thank you, and I'm so glad to be here with you, and I have been waiting for a long time, and I want to share a brief presentation, but I really want to hear your questions and your thoughts, and this is such a developing situation, and that every idea and every thought are important to generating this this development. But before I do that, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Rabbi Noa Sattath. I was born here in Jerusalem, where I'm speaking to you from, to a really, really secular Israeli family. Like, our Shabbat tradition was that my father would go to the non-kosher butcher shop and get bacon, and that's what we did on Shabbat morning. And my path to becoming a rabbi and to doing this work that I do today really went through social change work. I was the head of the Jerusalem Open House, which is the LGBT center here in Jerusalem. And back then it was the only LGBT organization in town. So I got to work with Palestinian lesbians, ultra-Orthodox gay men, every different sector of Jerusalem society that you can imagine. And that's where I got to see the destructive force of Judaism really ruining people's lives and the liberating potential of Judaism, allowing people to be all that they can be. And that's what really drew me. And when I left there, I worked at an organization called MEET, which was founded in MIT in Boston, which is an organization that uses technology to create connections between Israeli and Palestinian young leaders, high school students. And one of my major roles in that position, or one of the major challenges I had to deal with, was the reluctance of the Israeli students to engage with the Palestinian students. And we had really, really brilliant teenagers who were part of a program, which is like almost every encounter program between Israelis and Palestinians, has built-in advantages for the Israelis. Palestinians had to cross checkpoints in order to get there. We were in a Hebrew-speaking universe. And specifically for computer science, there are also advantages for Israelis because the Israeli education system is obsessed with preparation for computer science, and the Palestinian education system is totally not. And despite all of these advantages, the Israelis were just petrified. And I tried to figure out what was going on, and I did separate workshops and brought consultants and did all sorts of investigations. And the more I looked into it, the more it became apparent to me that the Palestinian students came with a really strong narrative, a really strong sense of self, both religiously and nationally. And the Israeli students, who were all phenomenal and who all came from secular Israeli high schools, couldn't articulate anything about their Jewish identity that didn't have to do with the Holocaust. And that has brought me, I really saw with these students how people build big walls around themselves when they're not secure on the inside. It's not only about an external threat. And if we don't know who we are, it's very difficult for us to meet anybody else. And that's brought me to an understanding that has really deepened since, that the void that we as a progressive camp have in Jewish identity has profound impact on how we see ourselves and how we see the other and how we think about justice. And there are many different manifestations to that, but I think that trying to radicalize and Hebrew, for example, is a great example of the potential, the bad place that we're in and the potential for change. So I'll just jump in, and hold on, let me just try and share my screen. So I wanted to start with a poem by Yona Volach. Yona Volach was a transformative Hebrew poet. She died at 41, but she was a radical thinker. She wrestled with Judaism. Her most famous piece of art was a piece of performative art with a soldier using to fill in for bondage and sex. She was quite a person. And this is a poem she wrote in 1985. It's very long. I only brought parts of it, but I'm happy to share all of it. Will somebody help me with reading? The poem is called Hebrew.
So we'd like to welcome you to join in. If not, I'll help out, but I know we have writers and poets here with us. All right, I'll do it. Hebrew. About pronouns and sex, English leaves its options open. In practice, each I has all the options. You is he or she. I is sexless. There's no difference. And all things are it, not man, not woman. No need to think before relating to sex. Hebrew is a sex maniac. Hebrew discriminates for and against, is forgiving, gives privileges, with a big gripe from the exile. In plural, men have the right of way. It's a thin line. It's a big secret. In the singular, chances are equal. Who says it's a lost cause?
There's another, just one more verse.
Hebrew is a sex maniac. Wants to know who's talking. Almost a mirror, almost a picture, forbidden by the Torah, at least looking at sex. Tell me in masculine, tell me in feminine. Every eye is childlike, an unfertilized egg. You can skip over sex. You can skip up sex. Who can tell the sex of a baby chick? Man created by nature before a conjugated verb is planted in him. Memory is masculine, creates sexes. The offspring are the main thing because that's life.
Thank you. So this is a poem from 1985, and it really highlights that everything in Hebrew is gendered. My laptop is gendered, the table it's on is gendered, my chair is gendered, every single thing has a gender. And there's no way, almost no way, we'll talk about the different ways to ask, how are you, without assuming the gender of the person you're talking to. There's very few ways to speak in the singular form without choosing a gender. In general, the way Hebrew works is that any plural, and that's indicated in the first verb, any plural reference is in masculine. Assuming that there's one man in a room with 100 women, then you would speak in masculine form to all of the people present.
She tried checking or calling and she thought you were asleep.
Which creates a situation in which this gender problem is both a feminist problem and a queer problem. And sometimes the solutions are feminist solutions that really are not giving space to the queer question. And sometimes the different alternatives and solutions are offering different ways of thinking for both queer and for both the queer community and for women in general. So I wanted to relate some of the solutions that people have been using over time. So this is a job posting. And so this is a progressive type of organization, a mental health institution in Tel Aviv. And they're saying, look at this. It says wanted with a dot, because this would be wanted for a man, darush, and this would be wanted for a woman. So they don't want to choose. Menahelet. Menahel is for a man, menahelet is for a woman. And then you see that they also use a slash. Darush, drusha, menahel, menahelet. And that's a lot of the, so this is the, I would say, common feminist approach, which is saying we're gonna slash or hyphen so that people can choose, so that things can relate to both men and women. Another alternative, for instance, the University of Tel Aviv uses it, is that when you take a test or you fill a form online, you choose your gender or the preferred gender pronoun at the beginning. So you say, I want to take this test with a female pronoun, and all the questions will be in female pronoun, or all the questions, and that creates different, but you have to choose at the beginning, and then you only have one during the entire process, but you could alternate each time that you do it. Another thing that, and what we're looking at here are kind of the mainstream options that are provided in large-scale organizations thinking about the representation of women. You see here, this is a website of major HMOs, healthcare providers. And what they're doing is they're just using the verbs without the conjugation. So you see, it's not, this is locating a doctor. So it's not, if the normal way to do it is ater rofeh, or which would be in masculine, or atri rofeh. So they're only using the correspondence with the doctor. So it's not conjugated. Entrance. So this is a way for them to avoid using any gender pronouns, which keeps it very neutral. The downside of this, which I think really is, you have to have the Hebrew knowledge, is that it sounds very distant. It's not even formal. It sounds like it's alienating you completely. So on the one hand, it's good because it's neutral, but on the other hand, it's very, it creates a distance. So this is one thing. One of the new political leaders in Israel, she's not new, but she's new in leadership position, is Merav Michaeli, who is the head of the Labor Party in Israel. And she, for decades, is using feminine language in the plural, which for a long time people have mocked her for. But she is in the feeling that you know, speech and culture create reality, and if we only talk about in the male language, then we're only going to be thinking about men, and we're only going to see men in our vision when we're talking about interests and political interests, and so she has really transformed that. And it's interesting to see on Purim, the Labor Party did a video of the different Knesset members who are dressing up as Merav Michaeli, and they showed how the different Knesset members from all parties, from the right and the left, have started addressing both men and women in the plural after she has led the way in doing that for so long. And again, that doesn't, none of this really fully addresses the issue of non-binary Hebrew, but it's in the vicinity of doing that. One cool thing that I wanted to show you was this project. So this is a new font, which is called Multi-Gender Hebrew. So it's a font in which you can write in both male and female. Let me. So here you see, you can add. You see, this is anashim, so it's either anashim or nashim, shavot shavim. It's a font that allows you to play with the gender in any way you want, and the slogan is you won't decide for me who I am, and the writing is open, and it's really cool. Many places are using it. For instance, in Tel Aviv, this is now the font on all of the schools, so that, you know, kids enter and it's Bruchim Habayim and Bruchot Habaot, welcome, both to girls and to boys and to non-binary people, all together in one sentence. And of course, the extreme right is already trying to ban this from being used in public spaces. And it's very, very cool. The issue with everything that I have shown you is that it's only it's very good for writing, it's not as effective for speech. Because speaking like this, at least if we're starting now, it will sound very cumbersome, very inconvenient, and so that's the next stage. The way trans and non-binary people use Hebrew, I've seen several alternatives, because every sentence almost has the gender of the speaker in it. There are several methods. One is only speaking in the past form and the future form. If you speak in the present, then it's always gendered. You can, if I say I love you, ani ohevet otcha, it's either ani ohevet otcha or ani ohev otcha. There's no way to say it without a gender. And so some people only speak in the future or in the past. They can say ani ohav otcha or ahavti otcha. This is gender neutral. And I have friends who only speak like that, and it works for them. But that doesn't solve the problem of the person who's speaking to them, because in the singular first form, then you can speak about yourself in the past and in the future. The way people refer to a single person, then that's also almost always gendered. And there are ways to work around some of it. You can say what's. You can't say how are you doing or how are you without it being gendered, but you can say what's up, and that's not gendered in Hebrew either. The other alternative that a lot of people use, a lot of non-binary people use, is just alternating, speaking in the female form one time and then in the male form, just going with the flow. I think that's what most of the people do. There's not really, that I've seen, a lot of people who refer to them in plural, but there are people who refer to themselves in plural, and then also that's also gendered, so they alternate. And I think that's a this situation where language creates reality really challenges us to try and imagine what the language would look like, which also requires of us to imagine what the society would look like, to think about non-binary or multi-gendered Hebrew in speech, and not only in writing. So I welcome your thoughts and your questions and your.
Well, thank you, Noah. Have you seen the non-binary Hebrew project? They're redoing the whole thing.
Tell me more.
Well, like instead of bot or ben, they use bet.
Yeah, yeah. So, but that's mostly for prayer.
Right.
And that's phenomenal. But language, if you're a Hebrew speaker, then language has a lot more usages than that. And I'm trying to think if there's a way to expand this one step further. And what would be the next step? And I've seen some of it done in liturgy. Mm-hmm. I'm also curious about whether one of the things that we've been struggling with, we just published a new Siddur for the Israeli Movement for Progressive Judaism, and there was a lot of discussion about the gender for God.
I love the introduction. I send it out all the time. It's so good. Did you have something to do with that?
No, but my wonderful friends and colleagues did. And I think that that's also something that needs more development before it becomes fluent. I think that, like, for instance, the bit is really, it's become a natural part of services, and people are just very, very comfortable with it, and it's become a natural way to prayer. I think that in terms of the gender of God, it is undermining so many assumptions that it's going to take time to get used to. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry if my questions are going to probably sound more American liturgical than actually Hebrew speaking, and if that gets to be too much, just tell me.
No, not at all.
Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of controversy these days over bar mitzvah, over what to call, because that's actually when most non-Hebrew, besides sort of rote liturgical recitation, that is actually when many American Jews need to confront the issue of gender in Hebrew when they come to that life cycle ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
What's your theory on what it should be called? The non-binary alternative to bar or bat mitzvah.
Yeah. I like the mitzvah, but I also think that this is an opportunity to think about whether the bar or bat mitzvah is actually a good name for what we're describing, right? Because it's I mean, the traditional thinking is, this is the moment where the person becomes responsible for their own actions, and then you do the Baruch Sheptaranu and all of that. But actually, in most of our congregations, the emphasis is not on that, and we don't do the Baruch Sheptaranu. The parents don't do the blessing where they say, we're so happy that we don't have to deal with the sins of this guy anymore, or this girl anymore. And so if we're innovating this ritual of transformation, then I'm not sure that bar or bat mitzvah is the right way to think about it at all.
Well, do tell. Come on. What would we think about it as?
I think it's a moment of self-definition, and that's also an opportunity gender-wise, right? That we could think about this not as and then the name would be different completely, which would have to be a very good name. So in order, every change in tradition has to really resonate.
Well, give me your on one foot thought.
Hineni.
It's really nice.
Because it's gender neutral, and it's the person who is becoming of age, this is their hineni moment, and that's an opportunity for them to say who they are in every sense of the word.
It's nice. Elias, I think you have a question.
I do have a question. Thank you. This is so exciting. So this is perhaps an archaeological.
Hold on, you're muted.
You're muted.
Okay, is this better? Can you hear me? So archaeological question. I was at Hebrew University in the early 70s, and there was a woman whose name I cannot remember. She was tall and slim. I was not out as gay yet. I would now look at her and say, well, of course she was a lesbian. Tall, slim, short, spiky, sandy hair going gray. She was not interested in text, but she had crafted, and I went to several of her meetings, a spoken Hebrew that was completely gender neutral. The only part I remember was that the plural, she played with all the roots, but the plural was, I'm almost certain, was odd. So every plural ended in odd, built on the shoresh. And over the years, I've asked people, have you heard of her? Do you know what happened to her? What did she do? Where did that movement go? And I've been asking this now since about 1975. She's vanished. Have you ever heard of her? Do you
No,
know
I wish I
anything about
had.
what she was
She
crafting?
sounds so cool. No, no.
There you
And
go.
the plural using a different ending is a great idea. I've not seen it used. So maybe
Yeah,
you
the
can
only time I
reclaim
heard
it
it,
for
she
her.
vanished.
Wow, so
I wish.
interesting.
I'm going to pass that on to you. I'm too old. You're perfectly poised. But thank you. I'm so excited by what you're sharing with us. So thank you.
I want to say that one of the big philosophical questions that we get asked for a lot is in kindergartens in Israel, because in kindergartens in Israel you welcome Shabbat, and then it's always Ima shel Shabbat ve'Abba shel Shabbat, Shabbat, the mother of Shabbat and the father of Shabbat, which are usually together, and of course that's heteronormative, and that's restrictive in so many ways, and it doesn't work for many of the children. And there's actually in one of the campaigns of the extremists, of the extreme right parties, they showed that in kindergartens in Israel, sometimes it's the angels of Shabbat, and sometimes it's the stars of Shabbat, and it's not gendered binary, and it's not mother and father. And that was so kind of like siren of warning for the big changes to come. And I think that on some level, it's hyperbole and it's fear mongering by the extreme right. But also I think that it's true that once we start changing the assumptions and changing the language, the change in reality is coming.
Haskell, did you want to ask something?
Yes. Shalom. Lekulchen. Yeah, this is fascinating and really inspiring. So toda rabba. Rabbi Noa, I don't know if you call yourself Rabba, whatever. What do you prefer, by the way, in Hebrew when to be called as a rabbi?
So that's very interesting. A lot of what I do is public work, and I work a lot with the media. And when I was ordained, Israeli rabbis can choose if they want to be called Rav or Rabbah. And there's a lot of debate on that. Some women rabbis feel that Rabbah is the feminist way to go. Others feel that Rav is the feminist way to go. Very, very big and important decisions. And I chose Rav.
Good, great.
And then in every single interview that I had on the radio, where you only have like 6 minutes to speak about racism in Israel, the 2 minutes were dedicated to why I chose Rav and not Rabbah. And after a while, I felt like this isn't serving me. I'm not being, and I go with Rabbah because that's clearer to people why so I go with the flow, whatever works for you.
That's great. I think my friend, Rabbi Ada Zavidov goes as Rav Ada. Anyway.
Right, she's my teacher. I did my internship with her.
That's wonderful. She's my good friend. By the way, I was one of the founders and co-directors of the open house in Ramleh, which is a Jewish Palestinian Reconciliation Center with an interesting history. Sometimes we got mail for the open house in Jerusalem. And once we got a $25,000 contribution through the New Israel Fund, which totally surprised us. And I thought that can't be right, and ended up for you. So that was great. Going back to this ad for the Kupat Cholim Leumit, I didn't understand what you were trying to say. It was all masculine nouns and pronouns. It said lachem and it said rofe and not rofa. So I couldn't quite understand your point in terms of it was alienating or distancing at the same time that it was neutral. It sounded like masculine language with the picture of a woman. somebody who
So-
looked, who presented as a woman. So I don't know.
So
what the
you're
point
right. The doctor here, Rofeh, is masculine. The Rofeh that you correspond with here is masculine. The
Yes.
Rofeh that you correspond with, the Rofeh that you locate here or you correspond with are all male. Of course, there are more female doctors in Israel than male.
Okay.
But when you press, I'll see if I can find the alternative here. So what I'm pressing here is itur rofeh, right? Usually it would be ater rofeh, which would be a conjugated verb referring to me as male.
Right. This is the gerund, and that's what you call it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. You can
That's-
also use,
So you could, so for instance, this button would be kanis, and here it's knisa, it's entrance. So it's not gendered, it's not referring to my gender as the reader.
Oh, I see. Okay. So these are for the imperative verbs, but it usually, for
You're right,
example,
it's still gendered.
it's still,
Here it's
yeah, and
gendered.
lachem,
Yeah.
usually they do a slash with a final nun, often.
Often.
So women, at least, don't feel excluded or discriminated against. So it's,
Yeah.
but I see I see your point now. Thank you.
Yeah. So I mean, there's just like there's an instruction manual for how you create a language that is welcoming to women, and one of the alternatives is refrain from conjugating the verbs. Just use and that's what they did here. I agree with you that they didn't, follow through in terms of thinking about who the doctors were and they went with the protocol.
Okay. Better than nothing, but long way to go.
A long way to go. I
long
agree.
way to go. Ruben, you had something you wanted to ask?
Yeah,
Hey,
thank you so
Ruben.
much. Hi, I'm so
Good to
glad to
see
see you
you.
and all of you. Hi. I was wondering, and I may have missed this, in which case I apologize, but I'm curious whether folks are experimenting with like mixing, like for example, pronouns and verbs. And I don't know, I didn't hear you say anything about that, but my internet went out. So, I don't know, ata ochelet or something like that.
Yes.
And I'm just curious whether that's a thing that people are playing with. I am not familiar with it, but I'm curious what you've experienced. Thank you.
So there are two levels of it. One is that in gay men's culture in Israel, men refer to themselves in the feminine form, which it's a very clear marker of a gay man. It's culturally identified, and it's a very subversive and radical thing to do. It's very brave to do that, and that doesn't. It's interesting how deeply it reflects non-binary gender identity, and how deeply it's just the culture of gay men in Israel, and it's and sometimes it alternates. Like, I'm being super gay and I'm excited about this song, so I will say, "Oh my God, ani mitalefet," and then I'll say, "Ani raev, let's go eat." And so that is definitely, it's very common. With the people who mix gender pronouns, who alternate between them, then that's a lot of the way it works. That they would say, they would speak about themselves and about others in alternating pronouns and verbs.
So I have a couple of questions, and everybody else should, feel free to. Back to sort of the issue of mixing up grammar forms, because the gerund is like le'echol. Like, what if would it just sound too weird for people to start using gerunds instead of conjugated verbs?
You know what? If I had to guess, I think that that's where it's going to go. Because it's much simpler.
Anila echol ochel, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. It sounds
weird.
it sounds weird. It's it's first of all, in Israel, there's the Academy for the Hebrew Language, which is a very traditional, very fun. They have the best Facebook page. So I'm recommending that you follow it. They have the best stuff on that. And they are the ones, for instance, who every few years are debating whether you can speak in plural in female form if there are more women than men, and they decide that no. And for example, they would definitely say that ani le'echol is very, very wrong. But of course, they don't decide. It's just an academic institution. They don't really decide on the way people speak. I think that would work in the long term, and it's it's a very concise way of reworking the language. And again, this would not fully solve the problem, because I and you are also gendered, but that would go a long way to addressing it.
Well, you could just use it for all of them.
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
I see. I see what you're saying. It would just solve the verb problem. It doesn't
Yes,
solve
exactly.
the pronoun problem.
It
Yes,
isn't some.
You raised the issue of the conflicting interests of feminists and queers, and I'd like to ask you to unpack that a bit.
It's not that it's conflicting interests. It's just the feminist issue, which is broadly understood, thanks to Merav Michaeli, but also, it was understood before her. It's much more clear. I think, the wanted ad that I showed you, or the HMO page, they're not doing it because they're worried about gender non-binary people. They're doing it because they want to, impress female women clientele. Sometimes successfully, and sometimes, like Yechezkel mentioned, not so successfully. And so some of the solutions would work for non-binary people, but I think that the mainstream, for instance, the font that I showed you, it will work. It works for all genders. But for instance, the solution that Tel Aviv University, which is a very liberal institution, what they're saying is you have to choose. You choose one gender, and that's the way you go with with all the forms that you fill later. And that's a feminist solution, because before I had to fill for them. I'm representing them. I'm not saying that's that for myself. They're saying, that's a feminist solution, rather than saying, before that you had to fill a whole form and all of your tests in the male form. And now there you go. You're all female all the time. And so there are places where the feminist interest does not include the non-binary interest, or disregards it, or even maybe hurts it in some level.
Do you see Ruben's comment?
I did.
That happens to me all the time, Ruben.
Exactly.
What gender am I today? I have another question, which is really Anglocentric, which is about sort of the trinary versus the unary. That is to say, in dealing with Hebrew liturgical terms by English speakers, there is some debate as to whether it's better to use a trinary system of male, female, other, masculine, feminine, other, or a unary system of fully gender inclusive for Hebrew. I think that's been resolved for English in that in almost every instance, English has been resolved to, instead of saying steward, stewardess, and flight attendant, we just say flight attendant. But
Yeah.
it is really up in the air in the Hebrew. And I'm wondering if you have a thought about that.
I would. I think that the flight attendant model should work well for that as well. I mean, I understand that the trinary, is that how you called it?
That's what I call it.
I've never heard that word. I understand that the trinary
I don't
model.
mean, it's slightly not neutral. It's my reflection on what I think, that it's just an extended binary, but
Yeah.
I haven't
So
heard enough for it.
Yeah, so I don't, I mean, I guess that people could find themselves more, particularly in the trinary model, but I think that I would go with the other model.
I see that's what you guys chose for God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Elias.
You talked earlier about groups of Palestinian and Israeli students coming together or not coming together well. And I'm wondering if you could speak on what patterns are happening in the Palestinian communities in Arabic around playing with binary language and gender.
Wow, I have no idea. I mean, I know that Hebrew and Arabic are constructed in the same way. So that would mean that we are encountering the same problems. But I have no idea. I've not heard of a non-binary Arabic project, which does not mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that I haven't heard about it. Yeah,
Great,
it's very
thank you.
interesting. It's very, very interesting. Yeah. How do you guys feel about the gender for objects? I mean, I don't think that it hurts the table that it's feminine. I don't think like there's a self-identification that is hurt there, but I'm wondering what it does that everything is gendered to a language and what it does when it's not.
This isn't exactly an answer, but I've always been fascinated by the words that historically switch genders out over history. Like, in the medieval times, they were one gender, but in biblical times, they're a different gender. Like, what's that all about?
Yeah.
It's not really the same question, is it?
I mean, it's interesting. And some things become non-binary. For example, the Academy for the Hebrew Language just acknowledged that socks are not binary. You can use them either way. Maybe it's because they're so flexible. But there are some objects, very few, that are non-binary. But it's
I always felt hamakom was one of the great, interesting gender words.
Yeah. So I don't know. I haven't heard people speak about that as an issue. But I think that's I think that has a way of influencing gender perspective, since you always are asking yourself, what's the gender of this object? It makes you ask all the gender questions all the time.
Right, Hebrew is a
that influence. I think that influences the way people think about language and the way people think about gender and the way,
Yeah, I mean, that's the poem you started with, right? Hebrew is a sex maniac. Like we're obsessed with gender distinctions. And And do you think that being, I'm curious about that, is being obsessed with gender distinctions sexual? Is that is it political, or is it sexual, or is it both?
I mean, there are a lot of theories that are about this. What objects are female and what objects are male, and what that means about the value of male and female in society. And there are many theories about that. In the poem, then the Zachar in Hebrew is from Zikaron, from memory, from tradition, and Nekeva is from Nekev, which is whole, basically. And so obviously there's a lot of value attributed to these things, but also you could say that otzma, power, is feminine, and so I don't know that there's a, if we calculate all the weight of what's gendered female and what's gendered male, that we would get to some sort of whether it would end up being equal or not. But I think that the fact that you always are focused on that the way people, the most common correction that people correct their kids when they're speaking Hebrew is they're adjusting the gender, because that's very complicated to learn. So, until your children are teenagers, you're correcting their gender pronunciations of different objects. And I think that is something that has an influence that could be changed over time.
Greg, did you have a question?
Yeah, hi. I came a little bit late onto this.
Hey, Greg. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. So, hopefully, I didn't miss the good part. But my question actually was about specifically what you're talking about right now. As a native-born speaker of a language that is largely not gendered in the way that Hebrew is, the questions over pronoun choice and other things like that are a much narrower scope question, of course, right? Like it's a great political and cultural battle in America, but it's about a very small set of words. And then once you're done with that, you're kind of okay for the most part.
And also you don't have to assume the gender of every person you meet.
Right.
There's no way to get to any conversation in Hebrew, or it's very, very difficult without assuming the gender of the person you're speaking to.
So my question is, because I'm conversant in some gendered languages, but because my native language is English, it's sort of hard for me to put myself fully, authentically in that space of thinking through a gendered language, as opposed to, I can rationalize, I can understand it. But my understanding is that there are some queer activists and queer folks in various other countries with gendered languages who are not necessarily satisfied with some of the solutions that we've been talking about here. And again, I missed the very beginning, so I might have discussed some others, precisely because of the completely gendered nature of the language itself, that it's not broad enough, right? Like if you can change the verbs that we're using so that I don't have to gender myself to speak to you, or can change the gender of how I talk to you, but again, I'm still gendering the table, I'm still gendering the house, that it's not necessarily enough, and it in some ways feels like not a solution worth pursuing. So I'm just curious if that comes up within the Hebrew context as well, or not so much. And I'm sorry if I'm not being clear. I think I'm being a little...
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the different languages that are as gendered as Hebrew, because French is also gendered, but not as dramatically as Hebrew in every pronunciation. Arabic is gendered in exactly the same way as Hebrew. But that's an interesting question. I don't know anything about other non-European languages. There could be a lot of stuff going on. There could be a lot of solutions that they're finding, and we can learn from. I think that ultimately our goal would be to be in a much more gender, in the much less gendered society, which would include the objects. At this point, I think that it's just such an offensive experience, such an experience of, deletion and exclusion for non-binary people, that there's a much higher priority to figure out a language that would allow us to express them and their identities in a clear way. And it's much more urgent than the work that has to be done in general, so that we don't gender everything and that we're not constantly focused on the gender of stuff. And thank you, Ruben, for that Finnish study. That's so cool to know about that. I'm gonna look that up.
Elisa had a question.
Hello, I'm enjoying this so much, so thank you. I was just dazzled by the font that is more gender, at least binary, gender inclusive, and by the use of the gerund on the website, so that we're not conjugating. My question is, to what extent are these kinds of changes impacting children growing up, or people who are not in this slice of kind of cutting edge folks at universities? Yeah, I'm curious. And I guess part of it is, you talked about the correction of gender up until kids are teenagers, because I think it's a sign of being well educated, and so this is another layer of education around language that I'm curious about.
So I think, again, here the non-binary issues and the feminist issues are different. When I grew up, I grew up in a classroom where they only spoke about Yeladim, kids in male form, and they only spoke to us in male conjugation all the time. Now, I think that most of the children in Israel today, when the teacher is approaching the class, she would say Yeladim ve'yeladot, boys and girls, which is very problematic from the non-binary perspective, but it's a whole different experience for the presence of women in the public sphere. So I think and it's interesting, it's relatively new from the last, decade, that there is such a big emphasis on that. And I don't know how it's going to shift the society going forward. I'm guessing there are studies on that, but I do not know them. In terms of the correction of the gender, it is really a sign of very poor education if you say, if you pronounce any object with the wrong gender. And that's why I think people correct their children to a very, until they get it right. But again, I think that's, there's no word for children, or there's no word for kids in Hebrew. So the experience of a non-binary person where it's always Yeladim ve'yeladot is very excluded. And maybe even you could say that when it was Yeladim and you knew that it also included other genders, then you as a non-binary person could find yourself more easily in that, rather than this binary definition, this you have to be this or that.
And Noah, when I was living in Israel, I started to just use masculine for me and for everyone else too, as it just exactly from that perspective. But then, somebody did point out to me that it could not be, well, my political point was not well understood by doing that. And that it's actually what your point was about using Rava instead of Rob. It's, at some point you have other things you need to talk about. So if you have to talk about that all the time, that's hard. So, we're coming to an end. And I just feel like I would be totally remiss without asking you how are you doing? What's going on? I mean, I think everyone who isn't in Israel, our hearts and thoughts are 100% with the situation. And how can we help you?
Send good thoughts and good energy. It's very depressing. On the one hand, the past week has been devastating, both in terms of the constant attacks from Gaza and the attacks on Gaza, which are all heartbreaking, and the mostly what was troubling to Israelis was the riots inside Israel and the continued violence between Jews and Arabs. And what we're seeing today, which is encouraging, is we started seeing yesterday a lot of the leadership taking ownership of the situation, both clergy and local leaders and then national leaders calling for an end to the riots and the violence. And today there were massive demonstrations of Jews and Arabs standing together against violence. And I'm hoping that will contribute to the calm. So any good energy and prayers, we need them, absolutely.
And then on a political level, thank God, we've had a change in government, may you as well. And
who knows?
Well, I hope. And is there any way in our political activism that we can be supportive now that we have at least a voice in our government?
I think that the U.S. administration has vast influence over Israeli politics, almost more than, it's almost more important who the U.S. president is than it is who the Israeli prime minister is. And we are in a cycle of election after election. And today it looks like we're going for a fifth elections this fall. And so the place of the U.S. administration is very important. And I think that the most important struggle that North American Jews have to deal with is to define what it means to support Israel in ways that reflect your values and not reflect an automatic agreement with whatever the policy of the Israeli government, no matter how crazy, is. I think that's once that is a common way to think about supporting Israel, then that's going to be reflected in the administration, and that's going to be immensely helpful to all of us here who are trying to create change.
Anyone have any last comments, thoughts, questions, prayers?
I have a thought with a question attached. Okay, this has inspired me to really embrace the paradox of the term Elohim as a plural name for one deity, one divinity. But if I were to say Elohim Yishmeru instead of Elohim Yishmor, would people start thinking I'm a polytheist? Or they'll just say, wait a minute, that sounds very strange. I don't know. I'm just playing around with the names for the transcendent, for the sacred.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a prayer. That's a prayerful thought too. That
Thank you.
we all need providential bolstering now, because it is very,
Absolutely.
very,
Yeah.
what can I say? It's yes, depressing. It's agonizing. The anguish is just, it breaks the heart.
Yeah.
But
I agree.
my sense, having worked for Israeli-Palestinian justice and reconciliation for my whole adult life, which is over 40 years, it's always seemed to me that incrementalism doesn't work. It's an illusion or delusion. And maybe you have to get really close to the abyss to step back and say, okay, something is radically wrong and in need of fundamental change, La Shoresh, really radical going, because this is all band-aids.
Yeah.
Even in the best, when we had a functioning government, I'm speaking now as an Israeli, when we had a functioning government, Maybe the dysfunction, you know, is a prelude to some clarity and shift. Inshallah.
Inshallah. I agree.
I think on that note, that
Thank you all for inviting me. I had a
thank you,
wonderful.
Noah. That was an amazing presentation.
you.
Tour de force. You are really a creative and inspirational force in the world. And thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all for coming. And we'll pick up again in the fall, and we'll see you then.
That's cool. Thanks for sharing that. You're